Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar. As COVID-19 affects every country in Southeast Asia, researchers are challenged to use their skills to understand the various ways the pandemic affects our societies. Research can also provide valuable solutions to the problems that we face today. Despite the circumstances, now is the time when up-to-date research on the impact of the virus is most needed in the Philippines and the entire region. The driving force of this webinar series is the desire to serve during these trying times. We want to make data available to government, policymakers, NGOs, and people who are capable of addressing the crisis. This afternoon's webinar is on the ethics in the time of COVID-19. We have three distinguished speakers and a distinguished reactor whom I will introduce later. But before that, I must state that this webinar is intended solely to provide information to the public. The views and opinions expressed as part of this webinar do not necessarily state or reflect those of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. Okay. So our speakers are philosophers, okay, from various parts of Southeast Asia. We have with us this afternoon Dr. Hazel T. Biana, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Salle University, Manila, Philippines, and she specializes in gender studies and feminist and post-feminist philosophy. In particular, she works on issues related to intersectionality and cultural criticism. The other speaker is Dr. Jeremiah Joven B. Joaquin, who is also an associate professor of philosophy at De La Salle University and a research fellow at De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. He specializes in metaphysics, logic, and ethics. And last but not least is Dr. Soraj Hongladarom, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. He has published books and articles on such diverse issues as bioethics, computer ethics, and the roles that science and technology play in the culture of developing countries. Now, after their presentations, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Andrew M. Bailey, who will be our reactor. Dr. Bailey is an associate professor at Yale NUS College, Singapore, where he teaches and does research in metaphysics and the intersection of philosophy, politics, and economics. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jeremiah Joven Joaquin.
Hello, friends.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Joaquin. Please go ahead,
There's
JJ.
some difficulty with Soraj's feed.
Okay, I'll try to resolve it.
Okay, so we'll start. Hazel is my co-author in this paper. I'll just share the screen. Okay. So I'll let my co-author start first.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I hope all of you are doing fine and safe during this time. So basically, this is going to be very informal. Just post your questions on the chat box if you have, and we'll try to answer them later on after the reactor. So a play with the title. We titled this talk, The Ethics of Scare, COVID-19 and the Philippines Fear Appeals. So this is basically an offshoot of a paper, next slide please, that we wrote for public health, which was published a few months ago, but came out in the June issue. So just a brief backgrounder for those of you who are not from the Philippines, what's actually happening in our country right now. So next slide. So basically, we've had one of the strictest and longest lockdowns ever, even longer than Spain and Italy. In fact, we're still in quarantine right now. And one of the cities in Visayas or in the south is back on enhanced community quarantine, which means they can't go out to buy goods. They can't go out to buy medicines. They're just, locked down at home for a few days. There are more than 30,000 infected, and the numbers are still growing, and more than 1,200 deaths. However, the Philippine response has been rather quick because at the onset of the virus, there was the enactment of the Bayanihan to Heal as One law, which has already lapsed this month. And the government called on the military and the Philippine National Police to be mobilized and to take care of the checkpoints and other COVID-related issues. Now, one of the very important requirements of the law is for the president to actually do weekly updates and reports, and this usually happens. This usually happened in the last few Mondays of the health crisis. One interesting aspect in the Philippines is that there has been a massive use of fear appeals. So there have been threats of imprisonment, fines for non-compliance with quarantine protocols, and hundreds of people were actually put into jail because of not following certain protocols. And every time, we hear the president talking, he'd give grave, or he'd spout out grave threats, such as, if they don't follow, shoot them dead. Or even worse, next slide, please. He'll send you to the grave. No, instead of causing trouble, I'll send you to the grave. Now, one interesting, or rather humorous use of a fear appeal is the use of the Purge soundtrack. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but in some cities and municipalities in the Philippines, they would use the Purge soundtrack to signal that curfew in certain cities have actually started. So what exactly are fear appeals? Can you tell us, JJ?
Thanks for the start. So what are fear appeals? We're using fear appeals like what Howard Leventhal explains, that these are fear arousing communication tools used to persuade others to act and behave in a certain way. So he published this in the 1970s. I think most of us are familiar with fear appeals because they're nothing new, actually. We use them, well, parents use them to discipline their children. We know this for a fact. Fernie, Hazel, me, Soraj, and everyone else who has children use fear appeals to discipline their children. Now, fear appeals are also used in medicine, like this headline, fear-based medicine using scare tactics in the clinical encounter. So when was the last time you heard your general GP quip, it's really important for you to do this, because if you don't, you might, then the fear appeal will happen. We also see this in public health campaigns. If you're familiar with our favorite hobby, smoking causes cancer, and so on. But right now, there's an ad concerning kissing can be dangerous. So the question will be, are these fear appeals effective? Do they really influence behavior? Some people would say yes. Others would say no. So people are divided concerning this. But they define effectivity in terms of how these scare tactics, these fear appeals influence behavior, change behavior. As an athlete once said, fear is a great motivator, right? Now, our question is not about effectivity of these fear appeals. Well, you could see that there are some advantages, right, social advantages in using these fear appeals. But the question would be, are they morally justifiable? So this is on ethics talk. So we'll try to focus on that particular question. Are scare tactics morally justifiable? Now, one might say that scare tactics are morally acceptable or they're morally justifiable, since they urge large population segments who are at moderate risk or adopt risk-reducing practices to influence those who are at high risk. If that happens, then it seems like these scare tactics would be justifiable, especially in this time of pandemic, okay, the COVID-19 crisis. You need a kind of tactic that would influence behavior. Now, on the other hand, some would say that these scare tactics are morally unacceptable because they violate certain moral and legal rights that people hold invaluable. For example, the right to travel, right? That's a basic right, that's a basic human right. So that's something that's deterred by using scare tactics. Now, these two things, these two schools of thought about scare tactics will be examined, right, from the vantage point of not really effectivity, but from the vantage point of morality. Because whatever the right answer to these things may be, it's something that the public should morally examine. Like in the sense of asking whether these scare tactics in cigarette boxes or parents disciplining their children using scare tactics are also morally accessible. Perhaps here's the funny part about the whole shebang in the Philippines going on. So, in one of his interviews, one of his press releases, our dear president tells us that there's no solution in sight for COVID-19. I just added that the last part, so that's not from the president. But you might ask the question now. What is he talking about there? He's scaring people, and he's scaring people to act in a particular way. Now, for us, right, as we end the paper and the presentation, we're just asking the question: Are we justified in using these scare tactics? So I leave the floor open for that question, and hopefully some of you will give us some answers in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, JJ. So our next speaker is Dr. Soraj, and he has joined us. So let me just shift the camera to Dr. Soraj.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
I'm
Dr.
sorry,
Soraj.
there is some problem at my house. They are cutting a lot of trees in my garden, and I thought that I would be able to stay at home, but they are using the machine to cut the trees. So I have moved to a shopping mall, and then they have this pipe music that I think you can hear in the shopping mall. So I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Or all you can hear is the music?
We can hear
Yeah,
your voice.
I am sharing the screen, but I think JJ has to stop sharing first. JJ has to stop sharing.
There.
Okay. Can you hear the? Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen
Yes.
and we can hear you clearly.
Okay. Yes. Yes. I'm turning this one off. Okay. So I start. Again, please excuse me for the noise and the music. I'm talking about ethical domains related to the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the issues and how do we approach the solutions? Basically, what I am doing is to present classification or categorization of ethical issues surrounding the whole COVID-19 pandemic. So let's move on. So here is my affiliation and my Twitter. In case you might want to follow me, you can see it here. It's right here. So what are the domains? There are 3 domains that I think are important when we talk about ethical issues in the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one is the domain of clinical setting. I think I won't spend too much time talking about the first domain, but at least we can have some general picture of what is there. The clinical setting is for medical doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals when they face problems or dilemmas dealing with patients. So the second one, the second domain is on public health. And this is something that the general population would be more interested because it deals with social distancing and other coercive measures designed to stop the spread of the pandemic. And the third issue, the third domain is also something I think very important. It deals with research and writing and research ethics. So first, we start with the clinical setting. What we have is the triage problem. You can see here in the topic. It comes from French verb triage, meaning to separate, to sort out, or to select. Patients come to the emergency room, for example, or COVID-19 patients who are in a serious condition, but there are not enough resources to help them. That is basically the problem I'm talking about here. And doctors and nurses and all the healthcare they should take care of first. And this can be a very heart-wrenching and very difficult dilemma. What you see on the screen, I'm sorry about all the noises. What you see on the screen is the history, brief history of the triage problem. It was first used by a military doctor belonging to Napoleon's, the first army in the last decade of the 18th century. His name was Dominique Chanlaré, and he devised a system or a method by which he could sort out patients who were soldiers coming to his care. So there was a system, and the word was used, and it became a standard word in the medical circles until today. So what should doctors do in case of insufficient resources? There are some ethical theories. I don't have time to spend on any of them. So I'm going to mention them, and then we might have some time, or those of you who are interested might take this up afterwards. There are the utilitarian approach, the Kantian approach, and the virtue ethics approach. Any of us who has studied basic ethics will know this very well. And there is the question whether there is any other approach. For example, in Thailand, we are Buddhist. So some people are talking about using the Buddhist approach for dealing with this problem. So let us move on. Here is a paper on the issue by Ezekiel Emmanuel from the US on fair allocation of scarce medical resources in the time of COVID-19. And basically, he is a utilitarian. What he is suggesting is that maximizing benefits is of paramount importance. So the idea is to save the most lives, most number of people, and the most life years spent living, right, as the result of medical care, and maximize prognosis, to make prognosis in such a way that most life years of any patient coming to the hospital will be saved. So this is the idea that he is suggesting. Somebody find this to be kind of objectionable. So philosophers have been arguing about this for a long time. The approach that this paper is against is first come, first served, meaning any patient who are already on the ventilator should not be taken out of the ventilator because he came to the ventilator first. The machine was used on the patient first. So it is unethical to take the ventilator out of this patient and to use the ventilator, the same ventilator to another patient who might be in more serious condition. The question is not whether the second patient is in a more serious condition. The question is that the first patient is on the ventilator first. He came to the doctor first, and the doctor has obligation to take care of the first patient. That is the approach. It is followed by some medical doctors, but according to this paper, they argue against this approach, and they went for this idea of maximization of benefits. That is basically the idea of this paper. And then there is another one on the toughest triage. By the way, these two papers, this one and the other one here, I'm so sorry about the situation in the environment. They keep piping all this music. Okay, I'm sorry.
It's all right, don't worry.
Yeah. Okay, what I'm going to say is that both of these papers are from the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most important and most prestigious medical journals in the field. According to this paper, written by Robert Truock, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He is suggesting that as for the triage problem, there should be a committee consisting of both healthcare professionals and ethicists, and perhaps members of the lay community to make decisions on behalf of the doctors, so that the doctors don't have to make their own decision, which can be, as I said, heart-wrenching and difficult. So the hospital level committee makes their own guidelines and decisions and sorted out cases, and then the doctors can follow. So that kind of lifts the burden of making the decision from the doctors. And this is taken from the abstract of this paper. So you can look it up afterwards. This is in Thai language. It's a standard procedure in a typical emergency room, and it shows that the triage problem has been around for a long time. The first question asks whether the patient is dying. If he is dying, then go to number one. The patient has the first priority. Can the patient wait? If the patient cannot wait, he's not dying, but he cannot wait, then he is number two, and so on, number three, number four, and number five. So this is standard in the ER room for medical doctors, and then we are talking about this ethical problem. So should there be, I would like to leave this question for, in your case, also for the Philippines. I don't know about the details, but in Thailand, we are talking about this problem, whether there should be a national protocol for triage, for sorting out patients in Thailand. There are not so many patients that doctors need to resort to triage protocols in Thailand yet, but we don't know the future. So it's better to have such a guideline. Number two is public health setting. Of course, we are talking about social distancing, and there are a lot of ethical issues surrounding social distancing. I'm going to read a bit here. In case where there is no effective treatment of an epidemic, isolating those who are affected from those who are not is an effective way. This has been the case in the SARS epidemic, the first SARS epidemic in 2003. However, this time the situation is much more severe. So we need more social distancing around the world. That is the justification. So effects on the economy, I'm focusing in the slide on Thailand. The national airline has gone bankrupted, so that's the most visible effect. People talk about that a lot. And the Thai economy has shrunk by 6.7, that is the old number. Newest number is by 8.3%, minus 8.3%. That is big number, bigger than the big economic crisis in 1997. So we are facing a lot of economic troubles and ethical issues. Where can we find a balance between social distancing and maintaining the economy? This is the question that everybody is talking about, and it's not easy to find a satisfactory answer. So we need to think, continue to think hard about how to find the best balance. And this is the first time in history where we have such pandemic of this scale. So there is no data available. The last pandemic in 1918 was, compared to this one, more limited in scope. There were some data available, but there were no airplanes, no internet at that time. So this is a new thing. And we don't have precedent, so we have to make educated guesses. Ethical issues concerning social equality. Social distancing measures have revealed hidden and not so hidden problems of inequality that are already there in many countries, including Thailand. In Thailand, it's sharply so because it's one of the most unequal countries in the world. Many are able to ride out the pandemic because, for example, I myself, I teach in a public university. I'm supposed to get my salary every month, even though the university is closed. But some people are not so fortunate, especially those who have to work daily for their living. Once their means of livelihood is stopped, then they have no income. So that's a big problem for them. Another set of ethical issues. How can we even start to address the deeply ingrained inequality problem in our meaning? You can include the Philippines, of course, society. Is the government scheme of giving 5,000 Thai baht. It's about, if I remember correctly, 2 Filipino peso for 1 Thai baht, somewhere around that. So we are talking about 9,000 to 10,000 pesos per month that the government has doled out to those who lost their jobs. Big problem is whether this is enough, and the time period of 3 months, is it enough? But the government says they have only so much money, so that's a big problem. There are many emerging health problems as a result of the social distancing, and this is a very serious problem also. Mental health, for example, people suffer from depression and so on because they cannot find their jobs, they have to stay home and so on. And there are a lot of cases of family abuses. has shot up as a result. The shrinking economy will result in dramatically less tax revenue. This will result in the government being tied down in their effort to find the disease. What to do? The Thai government has made a very, very large amount of loan, 1.9 trillion baht. Thai baht is a big amount. And many generations of us in the country, our children and so on, have to repay this loan with interest. So it's a big problem. So everything depends on the availability of vaccines. But there is no vaccine at the moment. So we have to endure. We have to stay put with social distancing from, for some time. And there is no real guarantee. Somebody says at the end of this year, we are going to have vaccine. Somebody says it's the middle of next year, who knows? We have to wait. Okay, and the third ethical domain that I would like to talk about concerns research and clinical trials. This is the domain that many people have not talked about much, so I would like to emphasize in the time that I have remaining. First issue concerns clinical trials of the vaccine. Many ethical questions emerged. Since there is a tremendous pressure from all sides for the vaccine to be developed as quickly as possible, there's the question of whether the usual steps required. Those of you who know the clinical trials ethics will know this quite well. There have to be step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on to ensure safety and ethical handling of everything. But that takes time. In our case of COVID-19, where there is a very strong justification for the vaccine to be developed as fast as possible, should those steps be kind of omitted? That's the question. For example, should there be control groups who do not receive the test vaccine but are already exposed to the virus? I mean, those control groups are sure to, they get the virus. It depends on their health condition whether they can resist the virus on their own. But without the control groups, we have no effective way to know that the vaccine really works or not. So that's the choice that we as global society have to make. So, and what about the more vulnerable groups? Women, children, the elderly, and so on. Those with conditions that make them more susceptible. A lot of problems about these groups also. What should be the role of research ethics committee? Now we come to the role of research ethics committee in research institutes and in the university. Usually they take a very long time to do their job. But of course, COVID-19, everything demands speed and effectiveness as fast as possible. So would there be a way for these research ethics committees to speed up their work? All the while, meanwhile, they have to maintain their ethical standard. Otherwise, everything falls down. So maintaining the standard while speeding up the work, can they do that? How to maintain research integrity if there is such a pressure on the committee to approve proposals as fast as possible. I'm talking about research projects, proposals for research money. There's some money available, of course, for COVID-19, but speed is important. But integrity is also important. If somebody approves of research projects too fast, then we might have some, not very best projects, or very ineffective projects. So what to do? The same goes for journal editors when they consider publications, consider manuscripts for publication, because right now there are a lot of papers coming out on the COVID-19, and journals are competing with one another to publish the latest result of the pandemic. But again, we have to find a balance between publishing as fast as possible and sometimes publishing not so reliable papers. Okay, I think that is all I have. Thank you for putting up with me. And I did not know that they have this loud music in the shopping mall.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Soraj.
I hope you can make them sense. You're welcome. So I'm stopped sharing now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hazel, JJ, and Soraj. Before we proceed to the reaction of Andrew, first I'd like to inform our panelists that based on the chat box, our audience are from across Southeast Asia. We have greetings from Luzon to Mindanao, as well as greetings from across Indonesia and Thailand. Okay, so it's a very broad audience. So now to the audience, should you have any questions, please feel free. Okay, for those joining us through Zoom, feel free to type your question in the chat box. Okay, you can also type your question in the Q&A section. Now, for those who are joining us through live stream in Facebook, you may also type your questions in the comment section of Facebook. Okay, and we'll try to address your questions later. All right. So at this point, we will proceed to the reaction of Dr. Andrew M. Bailey. So, okay.
I want to begin by thanking Profs. JJ, Hazel, and Soraj for raising some really productive and I think provocative questions. I don't have answers to those questions, but I'm going to share a few thoughts in reaction to them. But the big picture theme that I see across both of these short talks is that philosophy is everywhere, and in particular, ethics is everywhere. That is, I see opportunities, not just for science here. This isn't just epidemiology, this isn't just medicine. There are opportunities for serious ethical thinking here. And so this goes beyond social sciences, beyond the natural sciences. It takes us into, I think, a blended zone where we need facts, science, plus philosophy to actually make progress. So I see that as a guiding theme in some of the remarks. And now I want to speak more specifically to the two pieces. So first on the ethics of scare from Profs. JJ and Hazel. JJ and Hazel's big question here is, are scare tactics morally justified? And they're not asking if they're effective, but if they're morally permissible or okay. Now, I have an initial reaction here, and what I want to do is test this reaction and see what you think of it and see whether we can use this to make sense of the morality of scare tactics. I want to introduce a plausible moral principle that we can use to figure out this question. So here's the principle. It's that we should respect others by treating them as fellow subjects, as people, not as objects. So this is the thing that human beings owe to each other, to treat them as subjects and not as objects, not just as books or as rocks or chairs, but as people. So suppose that this is a basic duty that each of us owes to each other. Then we can ask this question, is it consistent with respecting each other that we use scare tactics? And I think a distinction could be useful here. So I'm going to distinguish two kinds of scare tactics or appeals to fear. The first kind of appeal to fear goes like this. You point out to someone a negative consequence of something they might do. We could call this a warning. So for example, when you see pictures of tarred lungs on a cigarette pack, that is a warning. It's a kind of scare tactic because it's trying to change your behavior using fear, because you're scared that your lungs will look like that after you smoke cigarettes. Now here's another kind of scare tactic. Let's call this a threat. This is when you try to manipulate someone by telling them, if you do this, then I will do something to you that you don't want. So instead of warning about existing, we might call them natural negative consequences, you create negative consequences for their action and then threaten them with those consequences. And I think JJ's and Hazel's example of Duterte's threat, I'll send you to the grave, that's a great example here. That is not a warning, it's a threat. So then with this distinction in hand between threats and warnings, maybe we can sharpen our question. Sometimes warnings, I think, are perfectly fine. That's what doctors do to us. That's what the labels on a cigarette pack do. But But threats, those seem a little less respectful, don't they? To threaten someone isn't to treat them as a person to be reasoned with, as a subject. Rather, it's to treat them as an element of the world to be manipulated, as an object rather than a subject. That's my initial hypothesis, at least. So then I think we can sharpen the question a little bit. And then my guiding hypothesis here is that warnings may be permissible because they're consistent with respecting other people. Threats, on the other hand, may be slightly more ethically dubious. So perhaps that's just something to think about. And here's the closing question I have here is, to what extent is manipulation, in particular, manipulation via threats, permissible? What would it take to justify the use of threats as opposed to mere warnings? And notice this has special application, of course, to COVID-19. We could simply warn people about the risks of leaving home without a mask. That's a warning. Or we could threaten them with death. That's quite different. So I think these definitely peel apart. And the second, I think, requires justification in maybe ways that the first doesn't. So there are my quick comments on the first paper. I'll turn briefly to the second. Prof. Soraj has raised a number of interesting ethical questions, basically spanning the way the world reacts to COVID-19. We have clinical settings, we have public health, and then we have the ethics of research. Now, it's tempting, I think, to appeal to ethical slogans to find guidance here. For example, a utilitarian slogan like, well, we should maximize benefits. I actually don't think that gets us very far. Here's a thought. It's not always clear what it is to maximize benefits and how to do so. But I think that when we combine those ethical slogans with what we actually know about economics, or what we actually know about human behavior, we can make better progress. So let me give an example here. We know from economics and from the study of human behavior in general, that those who are least well off stand to benefit the most from early or initial interventions. They have the most marginal gains, an economist would say. And to think about this intuitively, just think about, well, who would benefit most if we gave them 100 pesos? Me or someone in the Philippines who doesn't have a job, who is under pretty harsh ECQ right now? Now, I have a job. I'm okay. I'm in Singapore. I'm in a much wealthier country. I think I'd be fine. I won't benefit very much from the 100 pesos. Someone else will benefit much more. Their marginal gain would be higher. So here's a way to apply that and to make the utilitarian principle, maximize benefits, have a little bit more bite to it. What we get when we combine these is this insight that actually more utility is gained when benefits are given to those who are least well off. They stand to gain on the margin, to have higher marginal benefits. So that, I think, comes slightly closer to actually giving action guiding principles here. It can sound meaningless to say maximize the good or maximize utility, but we have this rule of thumb in hand that in fact maximizing utility often comes from benefiting the least well off among us first. Well, that can give us just a little bit more guidance. So there's just a big picture suggestion about how to proceed on these three dimensions that Prof. Soraj mentioned. And I just want to end with this thought, which is both ambitious but also kind of impossible. So I'd be curious to see how people react. I think that the questions we face here, they're not about virology, they're not about epidemiology, they're not about medicine. And they're not just about ethics. These are blended questions. They actually require us to understand the empirical facts about the world, the theoretical facts about economics and human behavior, and also the ethical theories that should guide our action. Now, this is incredibly hard because it means that we have to be scientists and social scientists and philosophers at the same time. Now, you might think that I'm just here to tell scientists, oh, you should pick up some philosophy. But I guess it goes the other way around too, doesn't it, fellow philosophers? It's on us to pick up some science and some social science too. And that's really the way to make progress. So maybe the question I have here is, well, how can I best pursue mixed learning, not just within my own field of philosophy, but spanning multiple fields and trying to integrate them? Now, that's a question and not an answer, but perhaps y'all will have something to say about that. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right, so any reactions from our speakers?
Well, I'll start because, yeah. So the first one is about the distinction Andrew made between threats and warnings. I think that's a useful distinction here. So warnings, as he said, will be something like, as a matter of fact, that smoking leads to bad health. Okay. So if I show that in a picture, like a rotting lung, perhaps, is that still a warning, or it's more of a threat? Because I could choose to smoke, okay? But if I see that thing there, it seems like I'm manipulated to think that, well, it would lead to this. I'm just thinking out loud. Perhaps the distinction between warnings and threats would be useful in actual or known cases, but perhaps here in the pandemic case, where a lot of things are unknown, the thin line between warnings and threats. But I agree that the premise will be there's a mutual respect between human beings. So I'm treating you as a human being, you're treating me as a human being. So as a human being, I could warn you, and that's morally fine. But if I threaten you, that would be something else. That's well and good. However, the question still remains whether in this situation, in this, a lot of unknowns, right? A lot of things that we don't know in the situation, whether it's morally justified to have threats, to use threats as well. Now, what we're arguing in the paper, in the original paper, was, actually, we're not arguing for anything. We're just opening the question. Okay. But I think that the distinction will be really useful here for everyone else. How about you, Hayes?
I think my question to you and Andrew would be, is it because of the harshness of the situation that there tends to be a difference between making a warning and a threat? For example, if you give a warning, like, you show this rotting lung like JJ's, you have time. You have time to think about it, to react. But in a time like COVID-19, probably the government is just so desperate that they had to, rather than just issue mere warnings, they issue harsh threats. So could it be because of, could it be because the situation calls for it? That's why it becomes a threat. So, that's just one question I have.
Yeah, Hazel, one thing I noticed in what you're saying there is that there's two dimensions here we could evaluate on. So there's the threat warning dimension. Maybe there's a difference there. I think there is. Maybe it's not quite so easy to pick it out, but I think there is a difference. But there's another dimension too, severity. So warnings can be benign or severe. Threats can be benign or severe. So here's a hypothesis. The more severe a warning is and the more severe a threat is, that actually increases the ethical justification required to engage in it. So then I think if we made a 2x2 matrix, a little grid here, we would see threats of the ones that like Duterte gave, I'll send you to your grave. That is both a threat and severe. So it looks like it has the highest burden of proof in terms of the ethical justification required.
So it's an x-axis.
Yes. We have X and Y, and it's in the far corner or something. Now, JJ, I think you're right to question whether this distinction actually holds up. And here's one way to try to be more precise about it. I think that warnings point out incentive and disincentive structures that are already there. So they say, here is a reason that is already there to do this, and here's a reason not to do it. Whereas a warning is a statement about how you intend to change someone's incentive structure by reacting to what they'll do. You're adding something to the game theory by changing the payoffs. So instead of just observing what the payoffs are, if you do this, then this will happen, you're actually manipulating the payoffs. And of course, it's okay to do that. That's what the criminal law does. It manipulates payoffs and makes crime more expensive. But it's not always okay to do it. And that's precisely the puzzle that we face here. So these are cool things to think about.
Okay, we have a question from our audience that's related to what was just said. So before we proceed to the comments of Professor Soraj to Andrew's reaction, this question comes from Dr. Raymond Tan of De La Salle University. So the question is, nearly all the lockdowns implemented throughout the world involve some degree of compulsion or threat. Can you comment on the gray areas or the degrees of morality in the implementation of the lockdowns? And since the lockdowns have legal teeth, they are de facto threats, right? So unlike the Swedish approach of trying to use reason, for example.
No, I like
Was that for me, or JJ, you want to take that? Please,
no,
please.
so it's an open discussion anyway. So I could start. So we can think about it in terms of getting on board to Andrew's suggestion that there's a spectrum of cases wherein you have mild forms of threats or warnings, and you have the extreme or severe case of threats and warnings. Now, add additional dimension to that, because you could have warnings and threats, but if you don't have the facts, the real facts, right? The facts about the number of infected, the number of dead people coming in, the number of possible infected, right? Facts about the health system, could they handle the COVID-19? So if you plug in those things in your equation, then it becomes that if you have severe case of infection in a country and you have low healthcare capability and you can't do anything except to threaten your citizens, perhaps that would be grounds to permit such a strategy. So the idea will be, if you have external facts, you plug it in, this issue about warnings and threats and lockdowns or not, you could, in principle, justify certain strategies, and it will be up for grabs whether it's moral or not. If your main task would be to, save lives, perhaps that's the best thing to do.
Okay.
How about you, Andrew?
I have one quick thought there. I think you've raised one salient factor towards possibly justifying a threat, that it's the last, it's your last hope of saving the world, that sort of scenario. Here's another one. It might be that to coordinate behavior and to communalize risk, that you have to use threats as well. So one peculiar thing about epidemics, or pandemics, I should say, is that it's hard to individualize risk. So when I walk around outside without a mask, it's not as though I'm the only one who's at risk. No, I'm actually spreading risk around my community. The only way to deal with communal risk like that is collective communal action. Now, it's kind of obvious that one way to get collective communal action is through force. But here's an empirical question that maybe we might want to think about. Is that in fact the best way to get communal action? We know that it is one way to do it. It's just to force people to conform behavior. Is it the best way? Is it the only way? Are there other ways of persuasion available to us? So this sort of touches on the initial theme, Hazel and JJ, in your paper about, I forget the phrase you used, like the science of persuasion, or it's like this is a tool of persuasion. So maybe we just fit those together. I think they're related.
How about you, Hazel?
I agree. I think we should also look at Soraj's presentation, because what Soraj did is that he enumerated a ton of ethical theories, which I think could also be revisited during these times, because right now it's really difficult to just use one ethical framework when it comes to evaluating these matters. So I think that also adds on to what Andrew said earlier, that philosophers, ethicists play a huge role in this crisis, and it would help, not just philosophy students or teachers, but everyone to actually revisit all these frameworks.
All right. So I wonder if Professor Soraj can comment on the reaction of Andrew. So I think he's having difficulty with his internet connection.
I would prefer, because of the noisy environment here, I would, but now it has been more quiet.
Yes.
So yeah. Could you repeat the question again?
Well, would you like to react to Andrew's comments earlier?
No, it's fine with me.
Okay. Well, we have some questions from the audience. One question is from Estrelita Llanita. How do we eliminate the fear factors in solutioning our current crisis? Do we follow the Vietnam model or the US model or the Brazil model? So anyone may respond.
Just a little bit from me. People will become less fear when they trust the people generally, people will have less fear if there is more trust. So as for the authorities, they will become less afraid of the authorities if they trust the authorities more. And people trust the authorities when the authorities are legitimate, when they see that the authorities actually do something that actually benefit the people. So it's something that have to be earned. Is that when people trust you, and they will become less afraid of you.
Well, there's a question here for you, Professor Soraj, and it comes from Valentino Lumowa of Manado, Indonesia. So it seems that people in Thailand are living the new normal since they have started opening the economic sectors like the shopping malls. Now, what is the argument underlying the practice of the new normal in Thailand? The argument of public health or the demand of economic pressure? Would you please expound on that?
I think I have written a little bit on this question, but in any way, public health is important, and Thai people generally, there are exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, they believe whatever the doctors tell them to do. And Thai people usually look at this issue, the whole thing here, as doctors' orders. It's more like technical and medical issues that they think they should follow. Those who cannot follow, those who suffer a lot, there are programs, and there are channels, either by the NGOs supplicating to the government or by the government themselves. So there are channels by which those who are affected adversely by the lockdown measures can help, can get their help. So public health is important, but the rights of the people are also very important, and because it's about the livelihood and the dignity of the people that is at issue here.
Can I the discussion here? I think Soraj raised a good point about trust. So if I trust my government, like I trust my mom or dad, I won't see what they're saying as threats, perhaps, because I trust them, because I think that what they're saying is for me, it's beneficial for me. So if that hypothesis is right, it seems like the threat idea, or what would become more of a subjective assessment. I'll say that it's a threat. It's threatening if you say that you'll kill me because I don't trust you as a government. Perhaps I'm not sure. I'm just playing around with that notion that perhaps in Thailand you trust your government and whatever they say won't be a threat for you. But here in the country, I'm not sure that in the Philippines, I'm not sure if that's the case. How about there, Andrew? How about in Singapore? What's going on?
Well, Singapore is a high trust society. It has been blessed for years with an extremely efficient and effective government. That government is becoming less effective and efficient in the last, since I've been here. I've been here for 8 years. And I think over that time, it's not gotten better. And one thing we see is that as trust declines, compliance with the law also declines. And compliance with not just legal requirements, but suggestions from ministers or warnings. And maybe that probably makes a lot of intuitive sense, that you heed the warnings of people you trust. And if you don't trust them, if they've broken that trust over time, then their warnings are less and less effective. And then the only thing they've got left is threats. That's the only way they can make you behave. And that's kind of a scary place to be, where it looks like the use of force and fairly draconian measures is all we've got to keep the world together.
Well, that's the case here.
There's another question here from an anonymous attendee. So it goes, is it morally permissible if a warning or threat like this is given, you may go out, but you're as good as dead when you do?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's a warning. It's really a threat. Okay, and
I
it's a
think
scary threat.
that's pretty much the same as what the president said a few months
Yeah.
ago.
Mm.
I guess we could ask the audience, is it morally permissible? Did it actually work? And if it did work, do you think it was worth whatever it was?
There's something here, because what do you mean by work? Does it mean that? Do you mean that we have less infections? That, well, the infections are controlled? Is that what we mean by work here? Again, in our case, I'm not sure that the numbers are right. But even if we set that aside, the question about whether it's effective or whether it works, again, the question will be, is it morally permissible? But I want to go back to the issue about trust. I think there's something there. Soraj, what do you mean by trusting your government? Because I think in Thailand, there's a cultural aspect that you are a monarchy, as opposed to like a country like the Philippines, which is democratic. Does it influence? Does it affect how you view your government? Soraj?
Yes, I wish I'm in a more quiet room. I made a wrong decision from the beginning. I should go to an open place, like, under the trees or something.
We hear you clearly. It's fine. Thank you.
Okay. So the question is whether it's about how can we trust. I mean, could you put the question again? I'm sorry.
Okay, so I'm making a distinction here. You're saying a while ago that you trust your government, okay? So you don't see that what you're doing is a threat to you, okay? It's not really a scare tactic. Why? Because you trust them. Now I wonder whether the difference between some reactions in the Philippines is that we here are in a democratic society as opposed to Thailand, which is more of a monarchy or semi-authoritarian government.
Okay, I think I understand the question. Uh, what the current situation is that we are, as you said, is correct, in a semi-democratic society. Uh, Even though the government would have thought otherwise, they would think that we live in a fully democratic society because we have the constitution and so on. But as for scare tactic, I don't think they, when they impose the lockdown or other public health measures, I don't think they are out to scare people. What they do is that they issue decrees or regulations, and they say that those who do not follow those decrees or regulations will be punished in such and such a way. And people fear, people, I mean, yeah, fear, scared. No, people do not want to be punished. Uh, it's, uh, it's the same situation as when you decree some kind of criminal law or traffic rules. If you break the red lights, then you will be arrested by the police. So the idea is that if you break the curfew, there used to be curfew, people are not allowed to leave their homes from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., for example. And police are everywhere during that time. And people generally believe, I mean, the feeling is that they don't think that the police are out to scare them. They think that police are there to catch those who jump the curfew. That's it. And they complain about the curfew. A lot of people complain about the curfew, but they accept the order as part of what the government is trying to do in order to combat the disease. So right now, still people, I mean, generally speaking, believe that whatever the government is doing, the curfews, the shutting down of businesses and so on, they are doing for the benefit of the people in order to combat the pandemic. Once they don't believe that, who knows what will happen.
Okay. We have quite a number of questions, and I hope we have enough time to address all of them. Okay, but there's a fundamental question that I think should be raised. Not everyone in this forum is a philosopher. I'm a historian, for example, and the audience members are not all of a philosophical background. But what I noticed in many of the questions is the use of ethics and morality interchangeably. So, as philosophers, is there a difference between the two terms, or are they synonymous, ethics and morality? So, this is really very fundamental.
Yes, short answer is that ethics is a field of study. It's a course that students study in the university or in schools. Morality, on the other hand, is concerns more the practice of a group of people. So there's Buddhist morality of the Thai people. So that is a short answer. Of course, there are long answers. But the idea is that ethics concerns more systematic. It's a branch of philosophy that is concerned with answering questions about right or wrong, good or bad.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment?
I just like to say that what the audience actually, what I see in the comments is that they really want us to answer the question whether it's morally permissible or not. And that's what we were actually trying to avoid doing in our paper. So I don't know, I'd like to ask Andrew, JJ, and Soraj, would you like to try to use a framework to analyze or evaluate whether it's morally permissible or not, or would you just like to avoid it altogether? the morality of these fear appeals? Anyone?
JJ, please.
Yeah. So what we wanted to do in the paper, Dr. Biana, is to really raise this question about whether it's morally permissible.
And
Now,
to avoid answering the question, right?
yeah, that's but now you're putting us on the spot and asking us whether, well, what's my take on the matter. Well, I like to think that fear appeals, if they're grounded on certain facts like um, facts like the number of cases that would be prevented if I use this one, if I use certain strategies like threats or whatever. If it would save lives, then perhaps I'll grant that it's morally permissible. The number one priority is to save lives. That's for me.
Okay. I think your comment addresses many of the concerns raised in the chat box already. But I'd like to uh, go back to an issue raised by Professor Soraj earlier regarding the role of ethical review committees or ethical review boards during emergency situations such as COVID-19. Because, well, you strongly stated that ethical review boards must maintain their standards. But at the same time, you also mentioned that somehow the ethical review becomes a hindrance to finding rapid solutions. So, of course, historically, again, from a historian's point of view, many of the unethical practices were actually done in times of crisis. Okay, so crisis somehow make unethical practices seem to be much more acceptable. So, stressing the fluid nature of ethical standards. Okay, so again, can you elaborate, please, on what you said about ethical review boards maintaining their standards in times of times of pandemics like COVID-19?
Yeah, this is a very difficult problem
Yeah.
because we are living in a very difficult situation, and it's a unique period. I mean, as I said, we don't have any precedents for this pandemic. So many of the things we are doing, we have to devise, you know, immediately without any lessons from the past. So, however, I think we still need to maintain ethical standards as far as it is possible. I say this because if we don't follow ethical standards, then on the one hand there might be a slippery slope, and then bad things and worse things could happen. Another thing is that we can do, we are in a position where there are technologies, there are more advanced knowledge on how to do the things that we need to do without endangering the rights or the health of the people. However, there might be in some cases very, very important, very necessary situation about vaccine testing, for example. There might be volunteers who are willing to test new vaccines without all the necessary protocols to protect their safety first. They know about the risks involved in testing the new vaccines. There might be some dangers, at best the vaccines do not work, but there might be some harms like toxicity or things like that in the vaccines. So if they accept the risk, and if they want to become something like they want to sacrifice their health and so on for the sake of humanity, that would be okay. I mean, but that would be the only choice. I mean, I don't think it's okay in all cases.
Okay.
Or, but if there is no choice left, and then if the pandemic is much more serious than it is right now, then and if they are willing, if they are really voluntary, then that might be possible. That's what I think right now.
It's a last resort. How about the others? Would you like to comment?
Yeah, so I like the issue about research ethics. So one issue is like there's a journal, I forget the name, Lancet. They're publishing
The Lancet.
the Lancet, yeah. They're publishing pre-reviewed works. Okay, so before any peer review. So they're publishing it out there, something like an archive material, so that people will see it. So anyone who's interested in developing vaccines or anyone interested in seeing other tools to prevent the spread of the pandemic. So one issue raised in that journal is that some policymakers use those pre-reviewed articles as part of their policy. So where do we strike the balance here between the urgency of the situation and we need to use whatever is useful to prevent the spread of the pandemic, as opposed to the question of, well, let's maintain our research ethics protocols. Right? So if it will save lives, why have the whole procedure of research ethics? But again, there's the Lancet case as well.
I think that's what the World Health Organization does. They publish papers, but they have a disclaimer saying that this has yet to undergo a more rigorous review, but they're putting it out there for the use of other researchers and for exactly for policy making. So I guess as what Fernie said earlier, these are trying times, and we have to we have to take all the information that we can. So in terms of research ethics review, how do we also make sure that the ethics review doesn't take so long? Because based on some of our experiences, it actually takes very long, and by that time perhaps we're all dead. So yeah, that's a very difficult question.
That's a threat, by the way.
No, but if you look at the WHO, that's what they actually do. They publish it with a disclaimer. So it's really up to the government to make sure that the information that they use should actually still be verified and should actually be researched on more. So yeah.
Maybe Andrew, would you like to comment? Okay. Well, my discomfort with that is that if there's something to be published already, then the presumption is that the experiment or the research has already been done. And thus, if there is anything unethical about it, then it's been committed already. It just hasn't been made public. So I think that is the contradiction there. Okay, but certainly that is a hurdle that many researchers are facing, because ethics review cannot be done quickly or rapidly. Okay, the ethical review boards have to take much care in ensuring that there are no violations of the ethical standards. Okay, well, all right. So I think we have around 7 minutes to go. There's a question here from Mr. Jim Miguel Edmilao. And the question is, do you think being morally or ethically accepting hinders a country and its people from adapting and progressing in this time of modernity and openness? So anyone can answer.
I'd like to have a stab at it. It's not. It's actually not a hindrance. Ethics and morality are there. Well, morality is there to for us to behave um, as a group, right? To to have good interactions together, to progress together. Okay, so I'm not sure whether being progressive and being modern is in contradiction with being moral or being ethical. I don't think that they're really mutually opposing here.
Okay. Okay, so we have a lot more questions, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time to accommodate all of them. But well, before we end this webinar, we're going to have the launch of a project, okay, known as Ethicomics. So Dr. JJ, can you please take over? I'm sorry, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Oh, hi. Thank you very much, Fernie. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this webinar. As we are in the theme of ethics in COVID-19, I would like to formally invite you to view our Ethicomics project, which is a project under the Southeast Asian Research Center and Hub in De La Salle University. This project is funded by the United Board for Higher Education in Asia, in cooperation with De La Salle University, the Philosophical Association of the Philippines, and Media Magnet. So Ethicomics is an interactive audiovisual pedagogical device for teaching and learning ethics. Okay? So it's a digital device that right now we are all proceeding towards online learning. So here you'll see some theories, okay, some thought experiments that you could use in learning ethics. So we're formally launching it. We're launching this as part of our search. That's all, Fernie. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. So on behalf of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Jeremiah Joven B. Joaquin, Dr. Hazel T. Biana, and Dr. Soraj Hongladarom for their presentations. I'd also like to thank Dr. Andrew M. Bailey for sharing his insights on these lectures through his comments. I found it to be a very enlightening discussion, and I'm sure that our participants, our audience members are leaving this webinar with a lot of questions that they can ask and think about for the next few days. So again, thank you very much. Thank you. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Goodbye.